you would have heard a pin drop. 300 of the most dangerous people in Italy were sitting in that ballroom, and not one of them made a sound. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across marble floors. Champagne sat untouched in glasses. Somewhere, an orchestra had stopped mid-note, the violinist's bow frozen an inch above the strings. Every eye in the room was fixed on one man, standing at the head table, and the woman seated beside him who hadn't moved in almost a minute. Luca DeSantis was still in his tuxedo from the reception. He hadn't touched his wine. He hadn't touched his wife, either. Not since he'd stood up, tapped his glass with a fork, and said the words that would end his empire before the night was through. I'm leaving my wife. Not a whisper in the room. Not a cough. Just 300 Mafia bosses, capos, and made men, watching a king humiliate his queen in front of everyone who had ever bowed to her. He didn't stop there. He told them Isabella had never belonged beside him, that she was ordinary, that she'd been a placeholder, a mistake he was finally correcting, because the woman he actually loved, his first love, was back, and he wasn't going to hide it anymore. Then he took the ring off her finger himself. Security walked her out, not gently. 2 men in dark suits, a hand at each elbow, past 300 pairs of eyes that had spent years pretending to respect her. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She didn't even look back at him. But in the last row, near the doors, an old man in a gray suit sat perfectly still and smiled. No one noticed him. No one thought to ask who he was, or why a stranger would smile while a woman was dragged out of her own wedding in disgrace. They should have, because by morning, phones would start ringing in 12 countries. Bank accounts would freeze overnight. Men who had sworn loyalty to Luca DeSantis for 20 years would stop answering his calls entirely. By the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why every Mafia family in Europe was about to get down on their knees for the woman Luca DeSantis just threw away like she was nothing. He thought he was ending a marriage. He had no idea he was ending himself. Luca DeSantis had never lost a war. By 34, he controlled more territory than his father ever had. Shipping routes through Naples, construction contract across 3 regions, a small army of men who called him Don and meant it. He'd built a reputation as someone you didn't cross twice. The first time was a warning. There was rarely a second time. He believed, completely, that he had built it all himself. With his hands, his nerve, his willingness to do what softer men wouldn't. He never once stopped to ask why his empire had survived so many wars that should have buried it. He simply assumed he was better than the men who tried to take him down. His marriage to Isabella had never factored into that story. 3 years earlier, it had been arranged the way these things were still arranged in his world. 2 old families, a merger disguised as a wedding. Isabella came from a quiet name, a family with old money and older manners, and Luca had gone along with it because she was composed, well-mannered, and asked nothing of him. She ran his household without complaint. She sat beside him at events and said little. He'd told himself, more than once, that she was lucky to have the life he'd given her. He never asked what she'd given up for it. To him, she was furniture. Necessary, decorative, replaceable. Then Vittoria came back. She'd been his first love, before the arranged marriage, before the empire, back when he was still a hungry nobody clawing for territory instead of a man who owned it. She'd left once, years ago, for reasons he never fully understood. Now she was back in Naples, and something about seeing her again made him feel 19 years old, reckless and starving in a way 3 years of comfortable marriage had never made him feel. He told himself this was fate correcting a mistake he'd made too young to know better. He told himself Isabella would understand, eventually, or she wouldn't need to, because what could she really do? Go back to her family's quiet, faded name? Disappear into irrelevance the way she'd always seemed built to? Standing in that ballroom, glass raised, wife beside him, first love waiting somewhere outside for his call. Luca DeSantis felt nothing but certainty. Tonight, he thought, he was finally correcting a mistake. He had no idea how wrong he was. Let's go back to the moment before security walked her out, because you need to see all of it. Isabella had been sitting perfectly still since Luca stood up. Spine straight, hands folded in her lap, The same posture she'd held through 3 years of dinners, galas, and meetings where men talked around her like she wasn't in the room. She'd had a lot of practice sitting still. Luca didn't raise his voice. That was the strange part. He said it the way you'd announce a business decision. Flat, certain, almost bored. You were never meant for this life, he told her, in front of everyone. You know that. Everyone in this room knows that. You're a good woman. Ordinary. Kind, maybe. But you were never a queen. You were never going to be anything more than a name attached to mine. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. She let him take it, let him slide the ring off her finger like he was removing a tag from something he was returning to a store. A few guests actually looked away, not out of sympathy, but discomfort, the particular discomfort of watching someone get erased in real time. Vittoria is who I should have married, he said. You were always just a placeholder. Still, Isabella said nothing. No tears, no trembling lip. No hand pressed to her chest the way you'd expect from a woman being publicly gutted in front of 300 witnesses. Just stillness, the kind of stillness that should have made someone in that room uneasy if anyone had been paying attention instead of savoring the scandal. When security took her arms, she rose on her own before they could lift her. She smoothed the front of her dress once, like she was preparing to walk into a meeting rather than out of a marriage. And here's the detail almost no one clocked. On her way past the last row of tables, she turned her head, just slightly, toward an elderly man in a gray suit sitting near the door. Their eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He gave her the smallest nod. She gave him nothing back, no visible response at all, and kept walking. Luca didn't see it. He was already turning toward the doors at the back, where Vittoria was waiting, already reaching for his next life. Isabella reached the exit. The doors were held open for her by security who wouldn't look her in the eye. She paused there for exactly 1 second, with the entire ballroom watching her back. She didn't say a word, not one, and somehow that silence was louder than anything Luca had said all night. 2 hours later, in 7 different countries, encrypted phones started buzzing at the exact same moment. No caller ID, no name attached, just a message delivered through channels reserved for the kind of news that changes everything. The Queen has returned. Prepare for her coronation. In Palermo, a boss named Contini read the message twice, then set his phone down very slowly, like it had suddenly gotten heavier. His hands weren't steady when he picked up his wine again. In Marseille, another man, a don who'd built his fortune on being unshockable, actually crossed himself. Old habit, older fear. He hadn't done that since he was a boy sitting in church beside his grandmother. In Zurich, a third man read the message and immediately called his second-in-command. His voice, when it came, had none of its usual command in it. Pull everything back from DeSantis territory, he said. Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. His second hesitated. We just signed with him last month. He's expecting the shipment by. I don't care what he's expecting. Pull back. Why? What happened? There was a long pause on the line. You don't understand, the boss said quietly. It's not about DeSantis anymore. It was never really about him. None of these men explained who the Queen was. None of them needed to. Whatever that name meant to them, it meant enough that grown men who'd survived wars, betrayals, and assassination attempts were rearranging their entire operations before midnight, based on 4 words and a name none of them dare question. An hour earlier, that same Don in Zurich had told an associate he'd back Luca DeSantis until the day he died. Now he was giving orders to abandon him completely. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast. And Luca DeSantis, still celebrating with his first love, had absolutely no idea his entire world had just started collapsing without him. By the next morning, Luca woke up to 43 missed calls. He assumed it was chaos from the wedding, gossip spreading through the usual channels. He didn't think much of it until he tried to access his main account to transfer funds for a shipment coming in from Rotterdam. Insufficient permissions. He tried again. Same message. He called his banker, a man he'd used for 8 years, and got a voicemail that had never once gone unanswered before. By noon, 3 more accounts were frozen. Not seized, frozen quietly, like someone had reached in and turned a key without leaving fingerprints. He called Contini in Palermo. No answer. He called Marseille. No answer. He called Zurich and got a single text back. Lost your number. Don't call again. 8 years of alliances evaporating in half a day. By evening, 2 of his own captains, men who'd worked under him for a decade, men he'd trusted with his life more than once, stopped showing up to check in. His head of security told him, awkwardly, that half the crew hadn't reported for their shifts. Nobody would say why. Nobody would even look at him directly. This is when the confusion in Luca's chest started curdling into something else. Something with teeth. Fear. He drove to his father's estate that night, the same estate he'd grown up in, and found the old man sitting alone in his study with the lights off, a glass of untouched scotch in front of him. Papa, my accounts are frozen. My men are gone. Someone is dismantling everything, and I don't understand what's happening. His father didn't answer right away. That silence, from a man who'd always had an answer for everything, scared Luca more than anything that had happened all day. What did you do? His father finally said. Not a question, a statement, heavy with dread. I left Isabella. For Vittoria. What does that have to do with? His father closed his eyes. You idiot, he whispered. You absolute idiot. Papa, tell me what's going on. The old man looked up at him then, and for the first time in Luca's life, he saw real terror in his father's face. You didn't marry a DeSantis ally, his father said quietly. You married the reason we still exist. Luca stood frozen in his father's study, waiting for the rest of it, dreading it already. His father poured another scotch before he spoke again. 30 years ago, he explained, the DeSantis family had been nothing, a minor operation, one bad decision away from extinction. They'd made an enemy of the wrong people, and should have been wiped out entirely. Instead, someone intervened. A family so feared, so absolute in their control over Europe's underground economy, that even mentioning their name in certain rooms was considered a death wish. That family had been quietly financing the DeSantis empire ever since. Every shipment that made it through unchallenged, every rival who mysteriously backed down, every debt that got forgiven, all of it had been arranged from the shadows by people Luca had never once been allowed to meet. They were called the Fontanas, his father said. Everyone believed the bloodline died out decades ago. A massacre. No survivors. That's the story that was allowed to exist. Allowed to exist, Luca repeated. What are you saying? There was one survivor. A daughter. Hidden, raised under a different name, kept invisible from everyone, including you. Luca's stomach dropped before his father even said it. Isabella. His father nodded once. Fragments started surfacing then, things that had never made sense until this exact moment. The elderly man who'd always seemed to appear at family events without explanation, introduced once as a family friend of Isabella's late mother. Isabella's composure in rooms full of dangerous men, never once flinching, never once out of place. The way certain problems in Luca's business simply resolved themselves without him ever understanding how. Isabella hadn't been raised to be someone's wife. She'd been raised the way you'd train a weapon, taught to observe every room she entered, to remember every name, every weakness, every debt owed. Taught that love was a liability and silence was armor. The elderly man from the wedding wasn't a family friend. He was her guardian, her family's last loyal enforcer. The man who'd spent 3 decades making sure the last Fontana stayed alive and hidden until she chose otherwise. The woman Luca had called ordinary in front of 300 witnesses had been the only thing standing between his empire and complete ruin for 3 years. And now she was gone. The estate sat at the end of a private road in the hills outside Milan, gates already open, as if it had been waiting for her arrival for 30 years. Isabella walked through the front doors wearing the same composure she'd worn at her own wedding hours earlier. No triumph on her face, no smile, nothing that resembled celebration. Just quiet certainty, the kind that made people move out of her way without being asked. In the main hall, 12 of the oldest, most powerful men in European crime were already waiting. Men who'd built and buried empires. Men who answered to no one. They knelt when she entered. Not out of theater. Out of 30 years of debt finally coming due. The elderly man from the wedding. Her guardian, the last loyal soldier of a bloodline everyone believed extinct, stood at her side and said simply, "The Fontana line has returned. All debts owed to this family are now owed to her." Isabella didn't ask them to rise. She let them stay there a moment longer than necessary, not out of cruelty, but because some things need to be understood in the body before they're understood in words. "Rise," she finally said. Meanwhile, across the city, Luca was unraveling in real time. He'd locked himself in his office, 3 phones spread across his desk, none of them ringing anymore. He'd sent Vittoria away for the night without explanation, unable to look at her while his entire life came apart around him. He kept replaying his father's words. "You married the reason we still exist." He didn't know yet how right that sentence was about to become. Back at the estate, one of the 12 men rose and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want done with what remains of the DeSantis empire?" Isabella considered this for exactly as long as it took to walk to the window. Milan's lights stretched out below her, half of them lit by money her family had quietly funneled through Luca's operation for 3 decades. "Freeze what's left of his personal accounts," she said, calm as a woman ordering dinner. "Not the company holdings. Those employ people who had nothing to do with this. Just his. Everything with his name directly on it. And the properties? Leave the estate. He'll need somewhere to sit while he understands what he's lost." No raised voice. No gloating. Just precision. The kind that told everyone in that room she'd been planning contingencies for this exact moment long before Luca ever stood up at that wedding. She wasn't punishing him out of anger. She was simply removing a piece from the board that no longer served a purpose. Luca sat at his desk until 2 in the morning, staring at a blank message thread addressed to a number he hadn't used in months, Isabella's. He typed 3 different versions. "Isabella, we need to talk. This has gone too far. Deleted. I made a mistake. I'll fix this. Please just meet me." Deleted. "You have no idea what you're dealing with if you go to war with me." He stared at that last one longest. Some old, arrogant part of him still believed he held the leverage here. That fear had always worked before, that a show of strength would remind everyone why they'd feared the DeSantis name in the first place. He opened a second thread instead, this one to the 4 captains who hadn't abandoned him yet. "Gather the men. We move against whoever's behind this before they finish what they started." 2 of the 4 didn't respond at all. The 3rd sent back a single line. "There's no whoever, Luca. You know exactly who this is now. We're not dying for your mistake." He sat with that for a long time. War meant fighting an enemy his own father was too terrified to name directly. War meant fighting people who'd apparently been controlling his empire's survival for 30 years without him ever knowing it existed. War against the Fontanas wasn't a war. It was a formality before an execution. Begging felt like weakness, but it was the only option that gave him a heartbeat past this week. He deleted every version of the message he drafted and did something he hadn't done in 3 years of marriage. He got in his car at 3 in the morning and drove to find her himself, believing that whatever this had become, he could still talk his way through it. He'd always been able to talk his way through things. Charm, threat, whatever the room required. He pulled up to the gates of the estate just before dawn, half expecting security to turn him away. Instead, the gates were already open, and standing in the doorway, dressed exactly as composed as she'd been the moment he humiliated her, was Isabella, not surprised to see him, not bracing for his arrival. She'd been expecting him for hours. Isabella let him stand there a moment before she spoke. "You came to beg," she said, "not question, or you came to threaten me. I'd like to know which before we waste each other's time." Luca opened his mouth, ready with something charming, something that had worked on rooms full of dangerous men before. Nothing came out. Standing in front of her now, he understood for the first time in 3 years that he had never actually known this woman at all. "Why did you marry me?" he finally asked. "If you knew what I was, if your family had this much power, why me?" Isabella studied him for a long moment, the way you'd study something you'd already finished deciding about. "You want to know the truth," she said. "Sit down. You won't want to be standing for this." He didn't sit. She continued anyway. 30 years ago, my family wasn't massacred by accident. We were massacred because your father sold us out. He gave up my family's location to the people who wanted us dead, in exchange for the debt forgiveness and protection that built the DeSantis empire from nothing. Everything you inherited, everything you were arrogant enough to believe you built with your own hands. It was paid for with my family's blood. Luca felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. That's not. My father would never. Your father has known exactly what I was since the day the engagement was arranged, Isabella said, calm as ever. He didn't marry me to you as an alliance. He married me to you because he believed if my family's last survivor was controlled, contained, made harmless inside his own son's house, the debt would finally be buried for good. So why go through with it? Why not just kill you both the moment I found out? Expose everything immediately. A faint, humorless smile. Because I wanted to understand exactly how deep it went first. Who else was involved? Who else profited from what happened to my family? I needed 3 years inside your house, inside your business, inside every account and alliance you had, to map every name connected to what your father did. She let that settle before delivering the rest. I have all of it now. Every name, every account, every man who profited from my family's deaths 30 years ago, including several people you call friends, including at least 2 men you would never suspect in 100 years. Lucas stared at her, and for the first time, real fear replaced his confusion completely. I didn't marry you for love, Luca, Isabella said quietly. I married you because you were the door I needed to walk through, and now that door has served its purpose. Luca's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. What happens now? Isabella stepped closer, close enough that he could see there was no anger left in her expression at all. Just finality. Now, the people who took everything from my family 30 years ago find out I never died, she said. Now they learn that the girl they thought they buried has spent 3 years inside their own houses, learning exactly where they're weakest. And me, you, she said, were never actually the target. You were just the man foolish enough to marry me without ever asking who I really was. She turned to walk back inside, then paused at the door, delivering her final words without raising her voice even slightly. You didn't destroy our marriage at that wedding, Luca. You destroyed your father's 30 years of careful hiding. That's a very different kind of ending. The door closed behind her. Luca stood alone in the driveway as the sun came up, finally understanding that everything he'd believed about his own life, his power, his empire, his choices, had been a story someone else had been writing the entire time. And somewhere in that city, a list of names was already being finalized. Names of men who thought their part in a 30-year-old massacre had been buried forever. They were about to learn otherwise. If you were in that room the night Isabella walked out in silence, would you have seen this coming? Or did you, like Luca, believe you were watching an ordinary woman lose everything, right up until the moment you learned exactly who she really was? Because this isn't the end of her story. It's only the coronation.